just very briefly thanking the whole project that Angus has been coordinating, and in particular the Instability Hub that Roger's been organising. It has been an extraordinarily interesting experience for us so far. So we're going to tell you a bit about what we found in our project. And it's work in progress. Its policy relevance, I think, possibly is not zero, but we're not, we're psychologists, so our thoughts on macro policy are probably somewhat ill-formed. We'll do our best. While we're waiting, I should say this is joint work with Jake Spicer and Drew Jankau, and also Adam Sanborn, who's unable to be here. So Adam's a professor in the psychology department at Warwick. Okay, so I'll start by showing you some pictures that will be all very familiar, just general scale invariant, illustrations of the scale invariant properties of markets. So there we see the normal, the rather spiky, bobbly pattern of a typical financial market. And as you zoom in on that market, it still looks bobbly in the same way. And if you zoom in further, it looks much the same. So that scale invariant shape is something that seems very, very widespread in markets and very interesting. And another interesting scale invariant phenomenon, of course, is the size of market movements. So if you plot on log graphs the size of movements in markets of all different types, different sized firms, entire countries versus individual countries, you tend to get these very, very nice straight line power law plots, which do again seem to be indicative of some sort of generic scale invariance. And of course, this is a clue, potentially, that there's some very general phenomenon at work here. The markets, to the extent they go scale invariance, may be showing it because they're governed by principles that automatically don't have any special scale. And of course, therefore, that might be in common with other systems that don't have a natural scale. So any complicated system which doesn't have any particular favoured scale is likely to generate scale invariant types of output. So one might wonder just how general these phenomena are, and perhaps they don't just arise in markets, maybe they arise elsewhere. And one might want to go into a little more detail and say, well, let's not just look at the general phenomenon of scale invariance, but let's look at specific stylized facts, some of which go into a bit more precise than that. So we stylized facts about markets, and ask ourselves, do those stylized facts also occur for other types of complicated systems? And we're going to focus on one other system in particular, the human performance. So the kinds of stylized facts that people have talked about, things like absence of autocorrelations in return, heavy tails in returns. Of course, heavy tails are particularly important from the point of view of stability and the liability of the market to crash horribly. Things like intermittency, clustering volatility, and we'll talk about some others also. So these general stylized facts about what you see in financial data, maybe they also arise in a fairly general way for a wider class of systems, not just financial systems. And I think that's interesting if you're trying to understand the way financial systems work, because you might try and do it by a very sort of economic, finance-specific style of explanation, or you might want to step back and do something more general and say, this is a broad class of systems, and that class of systems will automatically generate this wide class of phenomena. Now, we haven't got an answer to the question of how specific the explanation of these types of phenomena should be, but an interesting first step is to look at a very different type of system. And the system we're going to look at is data from an extremely simple psychological task with no networks, no cognitive interactions, no social construction, something extremely simple. All the person is going to do is going to tap on, as it were, the desk or anything else as regularly as they can. So it's a tapping task. Incredible that one would take such a simple task, but nonetheless we have. So we're going to get people to tap, and we're going to look at the sequences of timings of those taps. And we're going to find that those taps sometimes are long, sometimes they're shorter. People are trying to tap as evenly as possible, but they bobble around. Is it by any chance the case that the properties of that very, very simple psychological task happen to look anything like markets? And we'll see that perhaps the answer is more interesting than you might imagine. I'm going to hand over to Drew.
So basically we just want to start with a very just this psychological thoughts in macroeconomics, which we lay out in the end of this, is whether the price fluctuation could reflect any cognitive fluctuations in the belief chains. And we got, if we look back to the models, whether they're a statistical model or psychological model, economic model of the market, so we find some interesting theme in there. So you have the statistical model which can describe some fact of these some properties in the financial market, and we also have this proposed economic model, like Roger just mentioned, this quite prominent efficient market hypothesis, and we also have some behavioral finance model. But fundamentally, we want to ask these psychological questions: is to what extent is this price change in the market can be reflected by the degree of belief change, if in a trader's mind or in a market participant's mind. So we designed this sort of Turing task or the classification task. You can see two time series, and one of them is a purely psychological time series, and the other is what we choose is a Bitcoin US dollar exchange rate, which is based on I think the unit is the day. So it's a daily trade, daily index, and the other is the tapping task, as Nick just mentioned. So we can look at these two time series, and their log return time series. And for the Bitcoin US dollar exchange rate, it's kind of easy to spot. You can see the log return time series has clustering in the volatility. You can see a big jump, or often followed by another big jump. But weirdly enough, you can also see the similar patterns. At least, I believe, hopefully visually, you can see the similar pattern in the psychological time series in the tapping task. So this tapping task is, as Nick just briefly mentioned, is really simple. You just ask participants to estimate some time repetitively. So participants stay in an isolated cubicle, so their goal is to reproduce, say, 1 second interval. So they're going to tap, and then if they feel about 1 second has passed, then they tap again, and they keep doing this over 1,000 times. And that's the time series we got from this task. And if we treat their individual estimate as if they're priced in the market, which is a very radical claim, but if we do the same conversion and compute log return in this sense, these two time series, to our eyes at least, look really similar. So the reason why they look really similar is because they share common statistical properties, and I'm going to go over some of these properties. So the first one, which is quite prominent, at least for traders maybe, so this idea of absence of autocorrelation in return. So this property has been used before as a strong evidence for the efficient market hypothesis. But here you can see empirically for the Bitcoin US dollar exchange rate, we also don't see any autocorrelation in the return. So the autocorrelation is barely zero after, well, it's basically no autocorrelations. And we found similar patterns for the tapping task, except for the first lag. And then we look at this, the degree of heavy tailness. So we use this model-free estimation of tailness. We use the fourth standardized moment, which is the kurtosis. So we know financial market, the price movement has a heavy tail because if the price movement is a Gaussian, then we don't expect financial crisis happens that often. I believe the estimation, I believe the calculation for Gaussian market is you would expect a financial crisis to be once every 300 years, something. But then the reality is the market is heavy tail. So visually, if you look at that heavy tail graph, so that right line is the fitted Gaussian, and then you can see convert the same graph to a quantum plot. You can see visually where the heavy tails emerge as comparing to the blue line, which is the Gaussian. The opposite is this thin tail. If thin tail will be much more like the bottom. So we did the same analysis for the Bitcoin data as well as our typing task. So there's actually two properties, two statistical properties related to this. The first one is for the log return, when you compare today's price to yesterday's price, and you compare log return based on that, you will see definitely a heavy tail as shown in this. But there's also interesting finding, empirical finding in the financial market. You will see when you compare today's price against, say, 150 days back, and then you compute log return based on these two time, and then that log return are converging to Gaussian. At least the tail is not that heavy. So if we plot this kurtosis against the lax curve, you can see the tailness or the outliers or the degree of the outliers actually decrease over when you increase the windows between two time series. We did exactly the same thing for our tapping task, which is we also find a similar pattern here, although it looks a bit noisy and fluctuating down there. So that's about the heavy tailness. And then it's this volatility clustering, which leads to quite a number of statistical models, say the Gauge model. And it's also known as so basically here we treat absolute return as the volatility measurement. Well, I believe my reading of the literature says it could also be a square or other measure of the return, the square of the return as the volatility. But here I treat the absolute return as the volatility, and you can see the volatility actually decrease slowly. And if we convert this same plot to a log-log space, you can see it's actually really looks like a power law decay. And we did exactly the same thing for our tapping task. It also the similar pattern essentially emerged. Then there's this property of intermittency. I think these basically describes as you can see a very irregular bus in the return or in the price. So here, if you look at the exactly same log return time series. So the red curve is what we fit a Gauge 1-1 model. So it's very standard statistical model to filter out volatility clustering. So it did pretty good job tracking the peak of tracking the volatiles. These are the residue, so the unexplained part from the Gauge 1-1 model. But this residue still appear to some degree, still looks like very volatile, even we apply a Gauge 1-1 model on top of it. And this leads to this seventh property, which is conditional heavy tail, meaning even when you apply a Gauge model, it's designed to filter out some volatilities, but then this residue still have still have a high degree of heavy tail. You can see the kurtosis of the residual does not reach to zero. So basically that's my part. I compared the financial market and basically a Bitcoin time series against a very lab-based psychological task which participant repeatedly responds same estimation. So I want to pass on to Jake so we can suggest some explanation for why we expect these things will happen between individual decision making and the market decision making.
Okay, so yes, as you were saying, we've hopefully shown you that there's a lot of these congruent properties between full financial markets and even these very basic individual level time series. So the goal of our project was then to see whether there might be some shared connection between these things based on our kind of inherent existing work in psychology at the individual level. And the way we've been approaching this typically is through these sampling-based approximations to cognitive decision making. The idea basically being that people want to do the right thing. They want to be essentially rational, that they want to achieve these kind of Bayesian models of dealing with uncertainty in the most optimal way that they can, but we don't have the resources to do that. So we use an approximation where instead of working with the distributions themselves, we instead take samples from those distributions and work with those. And if you took infinite samples, then you would essentially be perfect, but people don't have the resources to take infinite samples. They take a limited number of samples, and that's where you start to see these errors and biases coming in. And in our previous work, we've been using a particular sampling algorithm, which we reduced to MC cubed. And this is a particular way of generating samples that we've been using at an individual level to explain these kind of key features of individual level data. And the goal of this project was to apply that to financial data and see if we could get some of these same behaviors that we just been through. Ooh, that's the wrong way. So, to give you a very brief introduction to how MC cubed works without any too many technical details, essentially MC cubed has various chains running in parallel exploring a probability space. And those chains differ in their level of exploration. So some chains are more explorative, they're more willing to go into lower probability regions, whereas some chains are more exploitative and will stay in a good place once it's been found. So if I show you this illustration, which is not playing. Okay, never mind. So essentially what this means is that you have a chain that the samples come from the one chain at a time, but at any given point you can switch between chains. And what this means is that you have this behavior, which should be playing in this illustration, but it's not. That means that you have a lot of small jumps, and occasionally you'll get these very clusters of big jumps. So very similar to this market level data, you have these clusters of volatility with periods of relative calm. And we've been using this at an individual level to see how people make decisions in these kinds of tapping tasks, how they make cognitive estimates, and the kind of fluctuations that exist in that. So we wanted to apply that to these higher level financial behaviors. So if we generate a time series from this kind of execute algorithm, hopefully at a visual level it looks the same. But going through those behaviors again, the MCQ algorithm shows very little order correlation in returns beyond the first time point. We see excess ketosis at short time lags, so these very heavy tails initially that drop off as we increase the time lag, so this aggregation of Gaussianity. We see excess volatility, this high level of autocorrelation in volatility that doesn't drop off quite as quickly and has a similar decay function to the financial time series. We can fit a Garch model, as we saw before, to explain this and get a reasonably good fit with this kind of clusters of volatility, but we still have excess ketosis left in that. So again, the MCQ algorithm seems to show us many of these same behaviors that we're seeing at an individual level as to these financial behaviors. So our question then is there a connection between these levels? Could the financial behaviors be built on these kind of decision-making processes that are occurring at the individual level? So in order to answer this question, we've been developing a market model, which uses MCQ algorithm to generate trader beliefs, and then those beliefs are aggregated into a simulated price. To do this, we based our model on the DeLong-Schleifer model, which essentially breaks the population of population traders into two types: rational traders, who expect movements towards fundamental price, and noise traders who have some systematic bias. The advantage of this is that because their systematic bias is a sample itself, we can essentially replace that sampler with the MCQ algorithm that we've been developing and use that to generate price predictions. So, not getting too deeply into the mathematics of what we put together, but essentially the pricing function is based on the beliefs of these individual traders, and the belief comes from this MCQ algorithm. So one element that comes along with this, though, is that we wanted to, if we're looking at individual variations in beliefs at the level of individual traders, we don't necessarily want a single belief in the market. So we added an extension to that, where instead of having a single representative agent for the noise traders, we split the noise traders into various subgroups with different beliefs. And we also added a parallel function across these subgroups so that there wasn't a kind of equality. Hopefully that's more reflective of the way markets work, in that some firms, like larger firms, will have more influence over the market, or maybe there are sources of information which are more influential because they're perceived as more authoritative, whereas there are lots of individual level beliefs that aren't quite so commonly held. So this is a simulated time series from our market model with that executed algorithm in place. And to quickly go through those behaviors again. Again, we see very little autocorrelation beyond the first couple of time lags in returns. We see initial high levels of kurtosis, so these heavy tails at the shorter time lags, but as time goes on, we see that drop off. So again, segregational Gaussianity. We see higher autocorrelations in volatility, so these absolute returns with a similar sort of decay function, so that it takes a while to drop off. You can fit a Garch model and see these intermittency, these clusters of volatility coming together, but we still see this excess kurtosis left over when we fit those kind of models, so there is still these heavy tails when we account for these clusters of volatility. One thing we can also do with a full market model is look at things like trading volume, which we don't have available in our individual level data. We can look at the kind of correlation between the volume of trading that's occurring at any time point and the volatility of the market. And this is another one of these criteria that we took from this quant paper. And what we see there is a moderate positive correlation, again, fitting with that kind of financial level data. Having said that, there are some aspects which our model can't capture, so we are hopefully trying to extend our model further to account for these things. Again, hopefully drawing on individual level psychology, things like loss aversion and maybe panic at an individual level, so these kind of psychological factors to explain these market behaviors. To hopefully provide a more complete model. So that's the end of hopefully showing you that the model simulates a lot of the same behaviors as the individual level data and the market data. And now I'll just hand over back to Nick to go through some of the further implications of our project.
Great. So very, very briefly, the 1 minute sign has already been flashed. So I think we've got three things. We've got a modelling system using this empty-cubed algorithm, which was originally developed and applied by us to look at other psychological phenomena. We've got some specific psychological data from our tapping task, but many other tasks would do. And we've also got financial time series. And the mysterious thing is, they all seem to have a lot of the same stylized properties. So the question, I think the fundamental sort of research question going forward is, what's the connection between these? So one possibility, natural for psychologists, is to say, well, we've got a cognitive model, a sampling model of the human behaviour in the tapping task, or it could be just as well a belief revision task or a perceptual task. And that then plugs into the behaviour of markets. It could be there's a sequence, or it could be there's just some very general class of complex systems of which all three of these and many other things are members. And that's why they all share the same properties. And we simply don't know. I think an obvious direction for future research is simply how do we, to test this, would simply be to build a lab simulation, simulated market, and to look at individual behaviour in that market, look at the overall market behaviour, and see how they interact. And I think more generally, it seems to us that if you're trying to understand markets, and it turns out that many of the stylized facts you're interested in pop up all over the place, that's just got to be an interesting thing to know. Because if you're trying to build very narrow, economic or finance-specific explanations in one domain, but they seem like they're unpromising explanations, and it turns out the same phenomena are actually much more general. Thanks very much.